We will get started in a few, and I would like to encourage everyone joining to not shy away. Absolutely, we have some experts here, but we're also here to learn from you. And I'll be dropping some, let's call them polarizing questions from time to time in the chat. So feel free to share your comments in the chat box. If you have any technical challenges, let us know. We make sure that we are sorted. So, ladies and gentlemen, estimated colleagues and fellow participants, welcome to this panel. We will be covering and talking about the power of data and how that can be used to scale up solutions for crisis response. Today, we embark on a journey to explore the intersection of technology, data, sustainable agriculture across our dear continent, Africa. But before we delve into our thought-provoking sessions, let's set the stage by introducing our distinguished partner. And I would like to start with Sembe Joy Ali.
Thank you, Usman. Happy to be here. And my name is Sembe Joy Ali, as Usman just said. I work for Development Gateway, and I am based in Abuja, in Nigeria. I work on the Visa project and the country lead for pleasure.
Thank you for being here, Sembe. Our second panelist, Scott Wallace. Over to you, sir.
Good day. My name is Scott Wallace with Wallace & Associates. I'm based in Portland, Oregon in the United States, focused on agriculture development, design to implementation activities in the African markets. Thank you.
Thank you, Mr. Wallace. Mr. Sebastian Duva.
Thank you very much, Osman, and thank you very much to the conveners for ICTforAg for having us on this panel. My name is Sebastian. I work for an international public organization called the IFTC, or International Fertilizer Development Center. I'm based in Kenya, covering the sub-Saharan fertilizer markets. And basically, our mandate is soil health and providing market information, market intelligence, and data to stimulate growth in the fertilizer market in Africa. Good to be here.
Thank you, and thank you to the three of you guys for being around. And without further ado, I propose we jump right in the subject. So I would like to start with Mr. Wallace. So what is the current state of overall fertilizer supply, and how does it impact agricultural systems?
Thanks, Usman. Yeah, so let me kind of set the stage of what this whole thing about fertilizer is, as most of the audience are probably not fertilizer specialists. So in 2006, there was an Africa Fertilizer Summit, which was really the first landmark event that had a focus on fertilizer on the African continent. The Abuja Declaration had a call for a target of 50 kg per hectare. And so let me break that down a little bit. So when you say a target of 50 kg per hectare, that target is a national target, and it has two components. What is consumption in the country in the year, and then what is the area under production of farming land under production. So in 2006, when that call took place, the estimated average on the continent was about 8 kg per hectare. The rest of the world is 170, 250 kg per hectare. So fertilizer use on the continent is extremely low, has been and was extremely low at the time. Coming out of that summit, there was actually a real need to get data. I remember when I was the IFTC Nigeria country representative that the International Fertilizer Association reached out to me and they said, Scott, we don't know what consumption was in Nigeria at the previous year. We don't know if it was 800,000 tons or 1.4 million metric tons. That's a $300 million variance. And so there was a need to actually focus on getting data. And there'll probably be some discussions on that during the session of what took place during the last 15 years. But that call to action was the first step. And we weren't even talking ICT. We're talking about getting foundational data, which is critical. So a lot has taken place in the last 15 years. And earlier this month was the second landmark summit, which was the Fertilizer and Soil Health Summit, took place in Nairobi in May. So there's been a progression in collection of data in maybe a third of the countries on the continent. There's still 2/3 of the countries that have very sparse data. So that's one component that I'd like to set the stage for. The second is what happened as far as in the fertilizer space and supply coming out of a crisis. And there was some major supply chain disruptions. Basically, our farmers need three nutrients, three primary nutrients: nitrogen, phosphorus, potassium. Potassium typically comes from Russia and the Baltic Sea. That crisis distorted and removed that supply chain. And prices went up dramatically across all nutrients. So there was a lot of countries that were struggling with how do they address that crisis. Multilaterals came in and provided a lot of budgetary support to address that, but that money actually ended up coming in and distorting the market. So we're just coming out of that crisis with some major issues impacting how product is being delivered to the country. So I want to give that as a framing. I don't want to go too far down into this whole thing about fertilizer, but I wanted to set the stage of the importance of fertilizer, so we're not mining the nutrients of our soil, and the importance of data, so we actually understand what the crisis was, as well as how do we make year-to-year decisions as a private sector or government. So I'll stop there and pass it back to you, Usman, just to set the stage.
Thank you very much. This is very useful, and that's a great entry point, because we're talking about ICT in agricultural sector, so it can be applied to several aspects of agriculture. And as the tone has been said, to imagine that most of the case study and use cases we'll be covering today will be around this specific agricultural input, which is fertilizer. So with that first series around ICT and the fertilizer sector in Africa, Scott have given us a comprehensive overview of the current state of that particular input, fertilizer supply, and also its impacts on agricultural systems. This brings us to an important aspect of this discussion, the role of data. So, Sebastian, could you shed some light on how data-driven insight could enhance fertilizer distribution? Why not the usage as well and productivity while we are there on the continent? Over to you, Sebastian.
Yeah, thank you very much, Osman. And I think Scott set the stage really, really well by painting the picture of where the continent was 16 years ago. And for the benefit of those of us in the audience who might not be very, very familiar with the fertilizer space in the continent, like he put it, just to pick up from where Scott left off, the fertilizer consumption in Africa is growing exponentially. Right now, we're looking at about 12% a year-on-year annual growth rate in terms of consumption across the divide. That being said, we are still lagging behind industry standards or the world averages for fertilizer consumption. But with this growth comes an inherent need for data. And I think ICT and the innovative tools around the ICT in agriculture have really lent themselves in assisting countries adopt better technologies for fertilizer use and nutrient use efficiency in the strictest sense of that word. So over the last 16 years rather, a lot of organizations and institutions in the African space have really, really stepped up. I would like to acknowledge efforts made, especially by the CGR Center, the Excellence in Agronomy organizations also represented in this panel here, who've all been working collaboratively together to ensure that the policy makers, the people in the trade, the private sector actually are equipped with the tools, the necessary tools to stimulate flow and movement of fertilizer. Some innovative tools that have been created to keep up with advising policy on these demands. As progress is hard in some of these countries, it's very important to understand the consumption trends. What products are being consumed in the market? What are the pricing points? Are farmers actually able to afford using these fertilizers? So some of these facets have been addressed exhaustively, and some of the case studies that as IFTC has been able to come up with over the last 16 years, we have been collecting data end to end, if you may. Back in 2006, we were just sort of understanding the players in the market. But over time, I think we've matured in the granularity of the data collected to be able to explicitly showcase how fertilizers are distributed in the respective geographies in Africa. But be that as it may, I would really want to emphasize the power of collaboration in coming up with innovative tools, because it's not a one-man show. It's a billion-dollar industry. And for us to go to move Africa's fertilizer consumption to the next level, I think very deliberate discussions need to be had. Very deliberate collaboration frameworks need to be developed in organizations within the African space to come up with intuitive tools that can be replicatable across the different geographies in Africa. Back to you, Osman.
Which is perfect. And I would like to start exactly where you start, intuitive tool. And here we're thinking about platforms, systems that have been developed. And we all know that whatever system you're building, data is at the core of it. And that's why we're getting into the second series of this discussion, where we'll be covering the importance of what we so often call foundational data for obviously decision making. So I'd like to go back to Scott again. I know you've been conducting some studies in the field, and could you please tell us more about the role of ICT that ICT is currently playing in the agricultural sector?
Well, I could paint a broad brush. The agriculture sector is actually quite large, and so you can go in many different streams, anywhere from, say, Uber for tractors, right? So Hello Tractor that is supporting how tractors are used out in the field and how you actually deliver and use them. There's a lot of ICT investments going on in aggregation of harvest, of outputs. There's a lot of space, a lot of work in that space. The team that we have as panelists have done some work as far as using latest technology to map area under production. I mentioned earlier that this kg per hectare has the numerator and denominator. That denominator is how do you actually map out what land is under production in a certain year. So there's been some innovative work going on in that. There's some work going on in yield response to understand and use the latest technologies to map yields in fields and use that with AI as well as with, say, satellite mapping. There is, coming out of this crisis, there's been a lot of discussion. Let me step back. In 2006, there was a big area of focus as governments provide subsidies that we should be moving to targeting farmers. And so that was a call to action, the Abuja Declaration in 2006. The last 15 years, there hasn't been a lot of success stories of using technology for that farmer targeting. Kenya is one example that I point to you, Sebastian, and your country mates, because of Safaricom and the broad network and reach you have for rural areas. So there's been some innovative work in pockets, but it is an area for those ICT people looking for areas of where future needs are. That farmer targeting and using technology to proper target is quite important. I know there's some discussions going on right now with the MasterCard Foundation to work with some key international and continental actors to try to refocus and redesign that process. So there's a few areas of the broad overview of where ICT is coming into play. Back to you.
Thank you for Mr. Scott for those insightful points. We have a dear colleague, Samuel from Nigeria, that I would like to hand over the next question to. We've been talking about data, all those activities, cropland mapping, all these data activities, collections. most of them are still have data at the core and center. From your experience, how does data has been contributing to the overall understanding the crisis that we went through over the past few years, especially since we are on that topic in the context of fertilizer supply disruptions?
Thank you, Usman. And if you can share up my slide, that would be great. Both Scott and Sebastian have spoken quite a bit already on the importance of data and some of the ICT interventions that have been used in the sector to do kind of like respond to fertilizer, and especially in the context of a crisis. You know, and I think a lot of policymakers and governments, stakeholders in the value chain as a whole, really had to come to a point of you know what are we doing in this context of a crisis, right? And the core question in their minds is, you know, how do we know how much fertilizer is being consumed? What kind of data do we need to be make or anticipate demand this kind of situation? And it went, you know, in 2020 on the onset of COVID, we saw it in the last year with the Ukraine-Russian war. And at the core of it, the scramble is, what is the data that we need to be able to make sure that when we find ourselves, especially on the continent, in a crisis situation, we have the data to be able to anticipate what it is the people, the farmers need to be able to curtail some of the effects, negative effects of crisis. And so governments and policymakers will think, I think, who is holding that data? Because when you do know that you need, you know, one data over another, the question still is who holds that data, you know, and then to decide in what context will that data be used to make certain decisions, and how are those decisions even being made? Those are some of the concerns. And so at the core of it, the answer usually comes down to having that foundational data. And we've seen very key is, you know, cost of fertilizer. What is the price of fertilizer, especially in a crisis setting? Because it's not just thinking about the cost of fertilizer now, but being able to see the trend and the patterns of fertilizer costs over time. So historically, what have the prices looked like, and how has it come off the transfer? And how can we ensure that farmers are still getting fertilizer at a price point that's comfortable enough for us to not feel it too much negatively in the context of food security, right? And then, of course, there's the context of the cost buildup. And this usually is especially more apparent in the case of a crisis, because Scott was talking a lot already about the disruptions that came with the supply chain, the disruptions along the supply chain with the war. And what that means is that it has an impact on how fertilizer moves from one location to another, and by extension, it's going to build up into the cost of what that looks like in the market at the end of the day. And this is a crisis, especially in a crisis where these disruptions are happening. It's going to impact even more on the price, right? And another thing that policymakers and stakeholders also think about in terms of a data perspective is consumption levels. What does this look like? How much fertilizer is being used at any point in time? But more importantly, in the years where there's a crisis, because it has an effect, not just within the year that is being considered, but it also kind of has a boomerang effect in subsequent years. And so that's also a consideration for how, you know, the consumption levels can be understood to be better, and you know, proper planning can be done. But, you know, no matter what, you know, you're thinking through in terms of the cost, the price, and, you know, the levels of consumption. And the next question is the product even available, right? So this is what you're thinking about. If you are able to understand what the price looks like, and, you know, all the build-ups, you know, you do all the fancy calculations and all of that, it still comes down to, yes, what is the product here? And access it. When I need it now, is it there? You know, so these are the disruptions and availability is the major concern, especially in a crisis, because the disruptions from seeing how the war, for example, from the Ukraine war, and of course with around COVID, meant that a lot of those nutrients were not readily available for countries and farmers by extension. And this all then ties back to the effect that it then has at the macro level at the economy, right? Because you then now start to think about how this impacts on what those macro indicators look at country. And to back to the point of what data policymakers are looking for and who is holding that data, how are they using that data, and how are they making decisions with it. We then have an example of a very interesting concept and mechanism that I have seen being implemented by the Africa Fertilizer program at IFDC called the Fertilizer Technical Group. And these working groups are set up in each country, about 18 countries where the Africa Fertilizer team works and covers on the continent, who are basically housed with the mandate to be able to say, this is what your fertilizer numbers are looking like every year in each country that they are represented. And this is a core group of stakeholders whose work it is made up of trade, such as customs, statistical agencies like Bureau of Statistics, the customs, and then you have the government, so the ministries of agri. You have production data that comes from private sector, such as the blenders and producers of fertilizer. You have other stakeholders, importantly in the value chain, who sit together in one room and really just talk about validation, and they digest and kind of like debate the numbers, and at the end of the day are able to come up with what the numbers are for each country. And then this is then cleaned and validated and accepted and adopted at country level as the data statistic for that country fertilizer. And the reason why this is important is because in a crisis, we tend to have a knee-jerk reaction into what is needed right now. But if you have a historical data that has told you and showed you patterns of consumption, patterns of price, patterns of cost build-up, patterns of availability over time, as it is done at the technical working groups, going back as far as 12, 13 years, it helps you to then understand what those patterns look like right now in a crisis. And so what you're doing with your data right now in a crisis scenario is not knee-jerk, and it's not like short-sighted, because you have historical information coming out of these technical working groups that then support you to be able to make the decision. And I really want to belabor the fact of having indigenous data at this technical working group level, because it is local data that is coming out of local players and actors and stakeholders in the ground, on the field, in the country, that then allows you to be able to trust that data, not just from your side as the user, but also as stakeholder in the country, as policymakers. This is data coming really from your value chain, and so you trust it. And that is the level of the fertilizer technical working group mechanism that we really appreciate and see that works, because the stakeholder engagements that go into being able to have this robust level of data allows that trust building mechanism to all be embedded in the process in a way that allows people to trust it. And so stakeholders can take this data and trust that it is valuable, is useful for planning, and is mitigating and helping them to anticipate demand in a crisis scenario. Back to Ms.
Thank you. And we might not, I don't know if you have time for that, but maybe in the next round of questions, it would be great also kind of like visualize how this looks like. I know when we're prepping for this session, we're mentioning the Africa Fertilizer.org website that was showing how data clearly visualized a drop in consumption and availability of fertilizer during certain crises. So moving to Mr. Nduva, what role do locally developed solutions play in addressing fertilizer-related crises, and how can they be harnessed effectively?
Yeah, thank you very much, Osman, and for your submission, Cindy. I think you already did bulk of the work in terms of responding to a particular question. But perhaps just to take a step back and frame what we are referring to as crisis in this regard, as you might have stakeholders in the audience who really are not very queued up on what the crisis is. So back in 2020, when COVID started, we really had a lot of disruptions around the movement, the free movement and distribution of fertilizers, and especially more so because Africa is a net importer of fertilizer. So anything that happens to disrupt that distribution chain and anything that happens to disrupt the source markets in this regard has a direct correlation or impact to how we actually access and consume fertilizer as farmers in Africa. So at that time, COVID really did lend a wake-up call in terms of trying to figure out how do we then understand how fertilizer is coming and how fertilizer is flowing through. The next crisis immediately after the COVID was the conflict that we saw in Eastern Europe. Now, with the invasion of Ukraine by Russia, that essentially cut off 40% of phosphatic-based fertilizers coming into Africa. Given that this is a major source market for Africa, it meant that we had to look elsewhere for alternative sourcing of product. But what that essentially meant is, with the absence of Russia now in supplying the global demand for phosphate, other source markets had to increase their prices and essentially had to look for higher netback or higher profit margin markets. So essentially that really did starve a flow of fertilizer coming into the continent. And just as we were getting out of the woods, climatic shocks and the macroeconomic situation really compounded a dire situation. So over a period of 2020 to 2022, start of 2023, we saw a lot of disruptions around the movement of fertilizers. And inherently, as interventions from different institutions and organizations were being thought of in the continent, the need for more domesticated and nuanced data providers within the African context was very evident. I remember at that time in 2020, when the UN Global Crisis Response Group was trying to fashion a mechanism of bringing together the private sector, the development organizations, in providing fertilizers at rebated basis or at free cost to markets in Africa. So at that time, they actually had to go to African-led institutions to understand the fertilizer balance sheets for the countries, and for them to then inform them which countries were most at risk in terms of unavailability of fertilizer and subsequently food insecurity. So understanding and having institutions within the African context that are really robust and strong in coming up with data sets and in coming up with innovative ICT solutions that can then be escalated at the policy level where decisions are made on how fertilizer then inherently moves. And as Sembe mentioned, one of the success stories to come out of this, I think, ICT approach, I keep on telling my friends that FTWG is the next best thing after sliced bread. And understandably so, because what the FTWG does essentially is to domesticate and institutionalized mechanisms at national level through which discussions on fertilizer pain points can be had, discussions around which policies are working for us can be discussed, discussions around which players do we need to crowd into the fertilizer value chain to make that system more efficient. So the work that the various organizations within the African continent, and I think we really must applaud them for this, they really have worked very hard to domesticate the FTWGs in the African space. And historically, where the FTWG started from, it actually was conceptualized and program that was called Country Start at that time, many years ago. This was actually under the Food and Agriculture Organization, FAO. So what happened is there was a convening of different representatives of fertilizer in the value chains in the national level. So this has since been, I think, institutionalized, and IFDC has really done a lot to that regard. Kudos to them. They really have worked hand in hand with national entities to sort of ensure that every year, there is a discussion around the fertilizer issues. And personally, I've been a beneficiary of these FTWGs because in my previous life, I actually used to trade fertilizers. And establishing new markets proved extremely difficult, but leveraging, I think, on the FTWG platforms was really able to inform our marketing strategy and which markets to go into. So incentivizing, promoting, and really sustaining these local-based and nuanced approaches really goes a long way, because what I've seen most organizations in Africa think global but act local, meaning that they have extremely robust golden standards through which they collect their data, synthesize that data, and therefore disseminate it. But they have the advantage that they understand the local settings of where they operate in. Back to you, Osman.
This is fabulous. So we're talking about overall the agricultural sector, the importance of that specific inputs, which is, sorry, fertilizer, the importance of having data available, and also what mechanisms are being operated on the ground locally to sustain those initiatives and to connect them also with institutions that we know. We talk about data overall. And now I would like to go back to Sembe in that third and last series of this panel to discuss, to talk about digital technology overall, still in regards to crisis management. And here I would like us to remain practical and to show and share concrete example. So Sembe, what digital technologies are currently available in crisis management responses, and how can they be applied to overall to the fertilizer related challenges that you discussed for the past few minutes?
Thank you, Usman. And I really appreciate that you said let's take it down to the practical level, because then I have an opportunity to show you in practical terms some of the tools that I've seen personally that have been very successful in able to share and use and show what data can do in fertilizer and in the agri sector as a whole. And the site you're looking at is the Africa Fertilizer.org. Here's the dashboard that houses a lot of the information that we've already discussed now. So Africa Fertilizer covers about 18 countries of Saharan Africa, Nigeria, Ghana, Kenya, all across, and it's scaling up even more countries, right? And when you come to the site, the first thing that you see is information around, price statistics, trade statistics, plant directories, and the countries that are. But one thing that is really interesting to me is the specific country. And under this country dashboards, as you can see, have about 18 of them in total. Is you can then see, like, drill down into the countries, which information is available under each country. And so maybe as an example, we can, because I'm Nigerian and I'm familiar with it. And so looking at the Nigeria website, the first information that you come to when you see when you come to the Nigeria site is a page that shows you, fertilizer prices. I was talking a little around cost build up before we got to this segment, and that's the first criteria, the first graphic that you see is cost build up per year, which then shows you, how the prices change year to year, and what are the different components that change with that to arrive at what fertilizer is. Something that I also think is very important and interesting, we're talking around, crisis and disruptions and all of that, is the apparent consumption graphic that you see on here is really key, very interesting, because as we've said, and you've heard from all the other speakers, a crisis situation with fertilizer sometimes will inevitably come with disruptions along the supply chain, which means, availability, consumption, all of that is affected. And you can see it really clearly on this graphic shown here. So if you look at 2020, you can see the total consumption for the year 2020, which is what the year where COVID hit, significantly lower than other years. And this is replicated again in 2020, directly linked to the Ukraine and Russia. And this, I think, is what data can, because you see at a snapshot how some of the conversations that we tend to hear that sound very theoretical in the ear are actually very clear to see when you look at it from a data perspective. because now you see what the effect of that crisis and the effect of COVID is in the impact of it looks like for apparent consumption in Nigeria, and just for the year 2020. You also see that you can visualize this data but you can also see other aspects of this of the data, right? So you see that, which we had talked about earlier for Nigeria. And as I explained, there is a clear break in the years where we had, the crisis and but another tool that I think will be very important and it's very, very key to look at, and it's in direct response to the crisis, is the African Fertilizer Watch. And you can access it by going to Africa Fertilizer Watch Dashboard. This dashboard basically breaks down what your overall country and market risks are for each country. And you can see just by a snapshot of the African continent, each countries have an overall risk where you see, for example, clicking on, if you look at Nigeria, the risk is low, but if you look at Zimbabwe, for example, the risk. And what does this mean? And you go to Malawi, the risk is, and this all have different ways of the indicators being calculated. Go down further into this. But the indicators at this for this Africa Fertilizer Watch really go through, sector responses, exposure to the Ukraine price, fertilizer market trends, fertilizer availability, costs and logistics, transport and borders. All of this put together is what is then used to a kind of ranking where they are at top in terms of their risk. And because we're talking a lot around the crisis to Ukraine and Russia risk crisis as an example to. If you click on this, immediately you see that Malawi, for example, it has really strong exposure. And so we click a little bit further, and there is an analysis broken down here that explains, what the impact of the war has on the market. And even though Malawi is, Russia really plays a significantly small role supplying fertilizer to Malawi, but the disruption in that region affected Malawi because Malawi imports most of its products, right? And so prices spiked and have worsened over time. There's also the issue of foreign currency shortage in Malawi. There has been a recent devaluation of a kwacha by 40%. And all of these factors then mean that overall there is the crisis from the war has more. And there are different metrics. So if you see what the overall risk is in terms of the narrative here, and you can see the sector responses, all of this, you click on this, you can see further how much how this exposure affects Malawi, and not just Malawi, but all the other countries as a whole. And so the reason I'm showing this tool in general is to, as Usman said, practically show us what are the tools that are available for us to be able to make informed decisions at a policy level, at the national level, at the regional level, able to say what is the position of the different countries working on or where we have interest in, what is the position, and how can we navigate what that position looks like to that food security as a whole is not impacted. And I think you have some time on your own. You can take a look again. The site is africafertilizerwatch.org, but the Africa Fertilizer website as a whole, which is africafertilizer.org, has all of the information. Then these are examples of some of the tools that I've seen that have shown good response in the crisis.
Thank you, Sembe, for taking us through those platforms. I think this is exactly what I was expecting, something concrete to back up all the discussions we've had previously. And I hope it's making sense on how data leveraged by great system could help and inform decision makers at all levels. And here I think we'll be looking at mostly private sector, non-profit, but also government for mostly policy-related work. We have one last question and intervention, and I would like to address that to Sebastian. So, given the discussion we had, what are the next steps based on your experience to support government and empower private sector? Indirectly, of course, we are looking at farmer here, but what are the specific next steps you are looking at in Africa Fertilizer to support those key stakeholders?
Yeah, thank you very much, Osman. And I would request the moderator to put up the 2 slides as I make my final submissions on this. Well, I think introspectively, it's not a matter of when or if a crisis will happen. It's a matter of when a crisis will. Because what we've seen over the last 16 years that we've been tracking the fertilizer markets within the African space, there has been 6-7 year cycles along which a crisis comes along. Be it a price crisis, be it a supply crisis, it's inherently going to happen. And the place of ICT in all this is to actually inform and forewarn national governments or private sector governments at whatever level in the African context of how best to prepare themselves for this. Now, the chart that is actually on your screens right now basically goes to show you the understanding of data sets that exist in the African space. So if you go to the next slides, you can actually see from 2006 to date, the number of countries having datasets has extremely exponentially grown. Back in 2006, when heads of state were making a resolution to increase fertilizer consumption in African space, we only had data for 4 countries. So I think to date, we are at a point where Africa is at the cusp of even greater things. And I'm very excited, especially on the backdrop of the just concluded African Fertilizer Soil Health Summit that took place in Nairobi 2 weeks ago. The presidents and the heads of states, as well as the entire industry, reiterated the commitment on actually ramping up the consumption of fertilizer. And it's not ramping up consumption of fertilizer for the sake of it. It's actually to ensure that Africa becomes food sufficient, both internally and also to feed the rest of the world. I believe it's very possible, and actually leveraging on these ICT tools will be extremely required by policymakers, will be required by the private sector for strategy formulation, as well as donors who are then designing the next programs and interventions within this African space. As Sembe has shown us, there is an abundance of ICT and innovative tools that could actually help the ecosystem even grow a step further. As we plug ourselves into the African Union Commission of growing existence of data within the 55 national countries within the African space. My last parting call, I think parting shot will be the need for collaboration, especially in this ICT space. There is a risk of duplicity because we have seen organizations more or less coming up with near similar things. So I think if we collaborated a bit more with all the expertise within this African space, we then can come up with very robust ICT tools that are internalized and domesticated across the divide. So as we're sitting here, perhaps in the next couple of years for another ICT4Ag conference, we'll be looking at a map that covers the entire continent in totality. And what that means is essentially we'll be growing not only our fertilizer consumption, but our food production and food productivity within the African space. Back to you, Osman.
This is awesome. Very well put, Sebastian. And thank you very much all for your interventions. We have about 15 minutes left for Q&A session and a conclusion. Yeah, so let's move on. All right, Maggie had to drop off now. Yes, perfect. Thank you, Maggie, for joining us. So opening it up for questions. Do you have comments or questions based on the different interventions here? Don't shy away. All right. So I think we are getting near the end. That means that the intervention have been pretty clear. But if you do have some more, please drop them in the chat. For those who missed the beginning of this intervention, we have drawn the panel that we have been reflecting, sorry, on the rich insight shared by the estimated panelists. And our journey through these three series has illuminated critical facets of the African fertilizer sector. And I would like to summarize our key takeaway, and this will be probably some insight even for those who just joined us. First, I have 6 points. The first one about fertilizer, putting fertilizer in context. We recognize the growing of consumption in fertilizer across the continent and the inherent need of data to inform sustainable growth. Innovative tools. Our panelists highlighted innovative tools driving this agenda, ensuring that the data-driven insight enhance fertilizer distribution, usage, and productivity. The role of ICT. Our agricultural sector is increasingly reliant on ICT. This seems in becoming more and more obvious. And data contributes significantly to our understanding of the crisis, especially during disruption in fertilizer supply. Our panelists, Sembe brilliantly highlighted that by sharing specific products that have been used for the past few years. Policymakers and stakeholders need foundational data, macro indicators, and key data points to anticipate demand during those crises. The Africa Fertilizer.org website that has been shown previously that website exemplifies this with its price data, consumption pattern, trade data, etc. So we invite you to check it out as well, and feel free to reach out if you have questions. Effective technology. Digital technology play a pivotal role, that's for sure, in crisis management. And the Africa Fertilizer.org website or the Africa Fertilizer Watch.org platform and the various country dashboards that existing demonstrate why data matter. And the last point I would like to cover here is more forward-looking. So next steps. We must support government, empower private sector, and directly benefits farmers. Our compass, based on the discussions we have today, seems to be around the 10-year action plan, collaboration, this is a key word from Sebastian, and expansion from the 25 to why not all African countries. Wouldn't it be beautiful and amazing that all leaders in all sectors, mostly looking at private, public, non-profit, and even farmers, have access to this data in a timely way? As we move forward, remember that data isn't just number. Let me repeat this. Data isn't just number. And it is the heartbeat of informed decisions. Let's continue collaborating, innovating, and scaling solutions that transform our agricultural landscape and nourish our continent. And hear me here by also saying by nourishing our soil. Thank you for being part of this insightful discussion, and let's sow the seeds of progress together. So thank you very much, everybody, and let's keep in touch.
Thank you very much, Osman. Thank you, everyone.
Thank you.
Thank you all.